being with us again. Hello, folks. It's Bradley J. Welcome to the Bradcast. We're with Rich Rubino, who is an expert on all things presidential and lots of things U.S. government. How do you do?
Good. How are you doing, Bradley?
You have some of the greatest books. You've got the trivia book and other books related to the U.S. government and the U.S. presidents. What books do you have in your catalog?
That I've written.
Yep.
Well, the first one was called the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics, which is kind of interesting facts from essentially all the way from the Constitutional Convention to contemporaneous times. Then I have another one, which is called the Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. Then one about the Electoral College, and then one about called American Politics on the Rocks, which is kind of all encompassing. And this one is called the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, which is about 500 pages of political trivia questions, but hopefully it's interesting, not just simply kind of isolated factoids. So this is my fifth book.
So, Rich Rubino, thanks for being with us. Cool. You look great, by the way. You have the lighting is good.
Awesome.
Your background is good. A lot of people don't pay attention to that, and I think that's a mistake. You look great. Thanks.
Aesthetics matter, I think.
So, especially these days. I mean, this is how everyone perceives you. You have complete control over it. You might as well take advantage of it. Now, things being the way they are these days, a little backwards. People want to get right to the subject, right to the meat of the matter. So let's get to some of the trivia and the stories, the presidential stories that I have promised. And we'll talk a little bit more about you and what you do later.
Okay.
Used to be in a talk show, you'd kind of lead up to that and introduce folks, but now people are out of there in 8 seconds if they don't get some beef.
Sound bites.
Yeah. So we have some questions that come from the book, come from the book. And a lot of these questions have stories related to them, so we'll get right to it. Here's one: which president gave a 5-inch bust of himself to the Pope? And tell the story of that event.
Yes. So the Pope came to the United States back in 1967, had a big event, went to Yankee Stadium, and he gave the president essentially a painting of the nativity scene, very fancy. And the president, of course, was Lyndon B. Johnson, known as, somebody who was kind of an outsized Texas personality, if you will. And in return, he gave the Pope a 5-inch bust of himself. Now, he actually had about 200 of these made in all different colors. And whenever a head of state would come and visit, he would essentially give them a 5-inch bust of himself as kind of a novelty gift, if you will. I think it's certainly a fascinating gift, and it's fascinating the Pope's looking at thinking he's going to get something that's tantamount to the picture of the nativity scene. He gets a 5-inch bust of Lyndon B. Johnson.
Isn't that kind of embarrassing for us, really? I mean, he had a real painter paint a painting, which is kind of a big deal, and it seems kind of self-serving to give a 5-inch bust of yourself, and kind of embarrassing.
It's fascinating that you brought up the word painting, because in 1967, Peter Hurd was painting the official presidential portrait, and Lyndon Johnson looked at it and he said, "That's the ugliest thing I ever saw." And he rejected the painting. So the painting's at a museum in Texas right now, but he had another painting being made, and Peter Hurd defended himself. He said, "Well, he only gave me 30 minutes to do the painting, and he fell asleep for most of the interview." If you actually look at it, it's at a museum in Center, Texas. It actually looks pretty good. It's got a picture of him standing there with a book, but Johnson actually rejected the picture.
So speaking of Johnson, the story of how a Secret Service agent shot Lyndon Johnson.
Almost shot. This is fascinating. So the day John F. Kennedy died, Lyndon B. Johnson, the thought was going to go to the White House. But actually, he gave the Kennedy staff a few days to essentially egress from the White House. So he went back to his home. And people weren't expecting this. So an officer comes up and he hears what he thinks is an intruder. And he puts up a gun. Someone's walking in. He puts it right up here. And it turns out it's Lyndon B. Johnson. And he has to take the gun away. Now, here's what's fascinating. So this is the day of the Kennedy assassination. If Lyndon Johnson were to have been assassinated the same day as John F. Kennedy, mind you, the next president would have been the Speaker of the House, Massachusetts' own John McCormick, who was certainly not ready for the presidency, because at the time, this is prior to the 25th Amendment, and the 25th Amendment allows the president to choose his own vice president if there's a resignation or a death in the vice presidency. So what happened about 5 days later, President Johnson addressed a joint session of the United States Congress, and behind him was John McCormick, who's 71 years old and very much looked his age. And next to him was Carl Albert, who's third in line to be presidency. He was the 86-year-old senator from Arizona, of course, the Senate pro tem, who is usually the senior member of the party which has hegemony on the which is in charge of the United States Senate, is usually sits up there. So that gave the impetus for the 25th Amendment, and Birchby of Indiana wrote it, and that passed in 1967, and that gave the president the power to essentially nominate a vice president. Then the Senate confirms him. Now, we came very close to the actually going from it. If that had not passed, when Richard Nixon became president, he would not have had a vice. When Spiro Wagner resigned, he had to plead for charges of tax evasion, basically going back to when he was governor of Maryland. Now, when Nixon ended up resigning, had the 25th Amendment not passed, and Gerald Ford not been nominated as vice president, the next in line would have been Democrat Carl Albert. So it would have gone from Republican Richard Nixon to Democrat Carl Albert. And Carl Albert, in many respects, didn't even know how well protected he was and how close he came to the presidency. Now, in the interim, when Gerald Ford became president, and before he nominated Nelson Rockefeller to become vice president, Carl Albert again was second in line to become president, the Democrat. And there was a coterie of Secret Service agents that would go outside of his apartment in Washington and his home in Bucktussle, Oklahoma, and some of the residents in the apartment building complained because they said that they thought it was just a group of hippies that were sitting in the cars all day.
Okay, now there's Jimmy Carter. By the way, we're speaking with Rich Rubino, and I think we're taking most of what we're talking about now from the Great American Political Trivia Challenge. But Rich has the Political Bible, little known facts about American politics, and the humorous quotes, the Political Bible humorous quotes as well, which are available on Amazon. Now,
yes,
there's
indeed.
the time I'm always stunned by the depth of your knowledge.
Oh, thank you.
We have Jimmy Carter. So I have the story about Jimmy Carter, but also a question: was Jimmy Carter really all that bad, or did he just have bad luck with that attempt at rescuing the hostages? The trivia bit is about the lust in my heart when he spoke to Playboy magazine.
Yes. So this was in 1976 when he's running for president, and Jimmy Carter was, of course, a born-again Christian. And he was asked, now, it was interesting, he was being interviewed, that he actually accepted an interview at Playboy magazine, but he did. And he talked about how he had lust in his heart, essentially, for other women than his own wife, Rosalind. And this actually began a precipitous decline. In the summer of 1976, at one point, Jimmy Carter was ahead of President Gerald Ford by 36 points. It wasn't necessarily that Americans were rejecting Ford as much as they were rejecting the system, the fact that Nixon had been president, Ford was actually a member of the same party. 1974 congressional election, the Republicans got absolutely shellacked. So Gerald Ford had a lot of coming back to do. And it began with Jimmy Carter making that declaration. And then you had a bunch of other instances when Gerald Ford started to come back, the convention in 1976. By the way, Jimmy Carter had a very interesting platform that year. Part of it was he would say, why not the best? He would say we need an outsider of Washington. He said he was, quote unquote, untainted by Washington. And in politics, it's probably the only field I can think of where a lack of experience is actually an asset, not a detriment. Gerald Ford had spent 25 years in the House of Representatives, become minority leader, vice president, president. But Jimmy Carter had been served essentially 2 terms as a state senator from Georgia, and then became governor and served 1 term as governor of Georgia. They could not serve consecutive terms in the state of Georgia at the time, so he could not run for re-election. And then he actually used it to his benefit. But Ford started to come back, and then toward the end of the campaign, it was almost tied, and Carter barely eked out a victory. And Ford later blamed it on a couple of things, obviously his pardon of Richard Nixon, but also the fact that Ronald Reagan, he thought did not do enough, would run against him in the primary in terms of campaigning for him around the country. Reagan said at the time that, quote unquote, he had other commitments. And there was also, by the way, that when Ford refused to bail out New York, there was one of the New York papers, the coverage of it said was Ford to city of New York, drop dead. And back then, New York was a swing state. So there were kind of a litany of factors on that election.
By the way, would Charlie and this is not any, don't hope no one gleans from the question or the answer any idea about what our politics are. But Charlie Baker, if he ran for president, would he have a shot?
No, I don't think so.
Why is that? Just because his party wouldn't accept a reasonable, excuse me, wouldn't like him. I mean, he might, in the general election be fine, but in a primary, not so much.
Yes, in the primary, he would. The Republican Party. By the way, it used to be, because you hear this term all the time, Republican in name only or Rhino. Well, actually, Charlie Baker's bloodline of the Republican Party used to be hegemonic. I mean, you had all through the 1930s, 1936, he nominated Alf Landon, 1940, Wendell Willkie, Thomas E. Dewey, 1944, 1948, then Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, was seen as kind of the face card of the Republican Party prior to 1964. Massachusetts has had Senators Edwin Brooke, Leverett Saltonstall, governors like Bill Weld, Paul Cellucci, Jane Swift. So there's always been a place in the Republican Party for even liberal, like Frank Sargent, liberal Republicans, but moderate Republicans. But nationally, the Republican Party has gone so far away from New England-style Republicans that he would certainly be called a Rhino. If you think about it, the last time there was actually kind of somebody who ran on his kind of a moderate to liberal Republican, certainly John Anderson, who ran in the Republican primaries, got nowhere, then ran as an independent and ended up garnering 6.6%. Lowell Weicker, by the way, former senator, later governor of Connecticut, was thinking about running in 1980. And Thomas DeMore went to some New Hampshire officials and told them, Lowell Weicker's thinking of running for president. And someone looked at him and said, essentially, let me tell you something, between New Hampshire and Connecticut, we have our communists up here in New Hampshire. Let me tell you something. Our communists don't even like your communists. Now, Charlie Baker really would have no chance as a Republican. Now, let's assume in kind of an alternative universe, he actually did garner the nomination. If he did garner the nomination, I cannot imagine a scenario where there would not be a third party that would pop up because of Charlie Baker's opposition to abortion rights and support for some gun control. Those are litmus test issues, social issues within the Republican Party. So I could not imagine a scenario where there would not be a major third party that would pop up if he were to garner the nomination. But I don't think he would have any shot. I don't think he sees himself as a presidential nominee.
Who would you say is our least known president?
Least known president?
Yeah, the stealth president. And tell a story about that president.
Well, I think there are a couple. I think Benjamin Harrison would be one. I think Chester Arthur would be another one. Chester Arthur, very interesting political figure. Somebody who actually was seen as a supporter of the kind of corrupt system, if you will. He was head of the collector of the ports, collecting tariffs, which was very powerful at the time. In New York, he was fired by President Rutherford B. Hayes of his own party. He was seen as somebody who was a tribune of the corrupt spoil system, if you will. Now, in 1880, James Garfield, who was a reformer, a mugwig they called him, he was a reformer, and he was somebody that wanted to reform the civil service system. He's a congressman from Ohio. He wins in a disputed election. He wasn't even a candidate. He was there supporting John Sherman, the Treasury Secretary of his own home state of Ohio. And then he gave a speech and someone said, let's nominate Garfield. And there was a stampede at the convention. Garfield garners the nomination. So to balance the ticket, they needed somebody from another state, certainly from New York, but they also needed someone who was seen as part of the civil service system so that they could essentially balance the ticket. So he chooses Chester Arthur. By the way, his original choice was Levy Morton from the state of New York. Was Levy Morton. But the Conkling machine, the Roscoe Conkling, who really supported the civil service system, told him do not accept the nomination. So he didn't accept the nomination, which he would have become president 9 months later. So Garfield dies, and Chester A. Arthur is now president about 9 months later. And what does Chester Arthur do? He turns his back on the civil service system, and on the opposition of civil service. And he shepherds through the Pendleton Act of 1883, which reforms the civil service. And now that is his main legacy. That's the one thing you think of. I know you think of Chester A. Arthur all the time, but that's one of the few things that's one of the few things that you think of. He also reformed the Navy, by the way. He did on the other side. He did sign the China Exclusion Act, which limited Chinese immigrants. So it's kind of a balanced ledger, if you will. But he'll always be remembered for signing the Civil Service Act, which he originally was opposed to, but he became president and he worked with the Congress and he got it through. So he's probably the most obscure, but you could also say Benjamin Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, who came in, was elected in 1888. Even though he lost in the Electoral College, he lost in the popular vote, won in the Electoral College, became president, and he actually was the first president to preside over a $1 billion budget. And then he ended up losing to Grover Cleveland, and the rest next is history. And his vice president, Levy Morton.
It's funny you bring up Chester A. Arthur, because I have dreams about Chester A. Arthur all the time.
Oh, I think, it's funny. I think everybody does. And whenever I say his name and people talk about Chester A. Arthur and they say, I haven't thought about Chester Arthur very often. I always tell them, my guess is Chester A. Arthur probably hasn't thought much about you either.
Okay, there's Bill Clinton. You have a lot of Bill Clinton stories. So there's something about a rivalry between Bill and Jerry Brown.
Oh, yeah, this is fascinating. So Bill Clinton gets elected governor of Arkansas at 32 years old in 1978. So then he becomes governor and he runs into some problems. He raised the fees for license plates. And then there was the fact that remember the Mariana boat lift when a lot of Cubans came into the United States. President Carter put a lot of them in Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. And this badly had deleterious effects upon Bill Clinton. So in 1978, he was elected. He had 2-term governorships at the time. 1980, he loses his re-election to Republican Frank White. And now he's the youngest ex-governor in American history. Jerry Brown was the governor of California, actually offered Bill Clinton a job working on his staff, which Bill Clinton rejected. So they had obviously a very good relationship at the time. Now, fast forward to 1991, 1992. Jerry Brown is a presidential candidate. He's a former governor of California. Bill Clinton is a presidential candidate that year as well. And they really had a bitter rivalry. Jerry Brown was running as a reformist. He would only accept $100 campaign contributions. He was basically running, saying that the whole system was corrupt. And he was trying to show that Bill Clinton was part of that system. And there was one debate, Paul Tsongas is there as well, where Jerry Brown really went after Bill Clinton. And he said, there's an article in the New York Times today, and Ralph Nader told me about it, that quote unquote, your wife Hillary has been the Rose Law firm where she works has been directly benefiting by you being governor of Arkansas. And Bill Clinton looks at him and says, now, Jerry, you stand up there with your $5,000 suit and you go after my wife. You don't deserve to stand on the same stage as my wife. And it really, if you see this on YouTube, it's really one of the most bitter exchanges you've probably ever seen. Bill Clinton ends up winning the nomination. Eventually, Paul Tsongas drops out of the race, or at least he suspended his campaign. Jerry Brown later says that during that campaign that he would choose Jesse Jackson as his running mate, which angered a lot of Democrats in New York, Ed Koch being one of them. The mayor of New York did not like Jesse Jackson. So Bill Clinton ends up garnering the nomination. And at the convention, Jerry Brown would not endorse Bill Clinton. They allowed Jerry Brown to give a speech, and he gave a speech, and it was almost all about the need for campaign finance reform, still would not endorse Bill Clinton. 1995, Jerry Brown's being interviewed by Frank Sisno on CNN, and he says, quote unquote, he was talking about the whole system being corrupt. He said, I didn't have a plan for California. Bush doesn't have a plan. Clinton doesn't have a plan, basically saying the whole system is rigged. And however, in 2010, when Jerry Brown wants to recapture the governorship, there was essentially a reproach mob between the two, and Bill Clinton came to California and campaigned for Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown later returned the favor and campaigned for Hillary when she was running for president in 2016. So they did kind of have a reproach mob, but you could see they started off as very close allies, became bitter adversaries, and once again became allies.
What do you suppose it is about Bill Clinton that made him so very successful?
Being able to come back more so than anything else. Somebody who I think first of all, anybody who comes from, Hope, he was actually born in Hope, but he actually moved to Hot Springs when he was 7 years old. But someone that comes from, essentially a broken family and a lower middle class family in Arkansas, to get from point A to point B, you have to be able to, kind of set your goals and be very ambitious. And it's amazing when you think about how he was able to get, from somebody for somebody where the background they came from, to become governor of a state at 32 years old, then to be rejected by the voters in 1980, very embarrassing. Then in 1982, he comes back and gets elected governor again. So he was able to, position himself. By the way, Dick Morris, the political advisor, was someone who worked very closely with him. And they had a strategy in many respects. So if you go back, when Bill Clinton was first elected as governor, he was attorney general in 1976. 1978, he's running for governor, and he has a pretty he has a pretty clear shot at running. So they knew that his biggest rival was Jim Guy Tucker. Jim Guy Tucker was a congressman who was running for a United States Senate seat, where they wanted David Pryor to win because they thought Clinton and Dick Morris did, that Tucker was going to be probably Bill Clinton's biggest rival. So they actually wrote campaign ads against Jim Guy Tucker for David Pryor. David Pryor ends up winning that election. Fast forward to 1982, Jim Guy Tucker is running for governor against Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, they had a very bitter, they did, as it turned out, two Ivy League Southerners. I think one of them would have become president at some point. Bill Clinton ends up defeating Jim Guy Tucker that year, then goes on to defeat Frank White again, 1982. And then he takes on a very interesting cause as governor. He took on the unions, and he took on specifically the teachers' unions, because if you think about what he's best known for as governor of Arkansas, he was the first governor in the entire country to institute mandatory competency testing for all educators in the state of Arkansas. And the unions were blistering in attacks on him. And so at one point, it seemed like the state Senate, the Democratic overwhelmingly state Senate, would vote against Clinton's proposal. So he comes on the radio and he talks about the state senators, why they should support this proposal. And eventually the proposal gets through. And Bill Clinton, seen certainly as kind of a adversary of the unions. Then he gets reelected again in 1986. Now in 1990, very interesting. It appears people thought he was going to run for president. He would not seek reelection. So Jim Guy Tucker decides he's going to run for governor. Then at the last minute, Bill Clinton says, you know what, I'm going to seek reelection. So he seeks reelection. Tucker runs for lieutenant governor instead. But he has a very bitter, remember, this is 2 years before he runs for president. He has a very tough reelection race in the Democratic primary. And there was one instance where his opponent, Tom McRae, who had been the 14 years chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, was in Little Rock talking, basically excoriating the Clinton administration in Arkansas. Hillary Clinton walks by, and Hillary Clinton starts yelling at him, talking all the times that he had praised Bill Clinton, and then he had no response. Bill Clinton ends up winning, and then he wins. He ends up winning with only 53% of the vote. Then the general election, he beats Republican Sheffield Nelson. Then he had made a promise that he would serve out his full term as governor. But then he says, essentially went on a listening tour and said, the voters in my state thinks I can be better as president than as governor. He's someone who really knows about timing and knows about positioning.
Rich Rubino is an expert on presidential politics, United States politics, and he's got some great books: The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, The Political Bible, Little Known Facts About American Politics, and then a humorous version of that. And you have a couple other books as well. Who would you say would be the funniest president?
Funniest, I would say Calvin Coolidge.
He had the dry wit.
The dry wit. Oh, absolutely. He's not somebody that, necessarily, would laugh at his own jokes, but he had some great lines. For example, when Calvin Coolidge became vice president, Lieutenant Governor Channing Cox succeeded him. And Calvin Coolidge came back about a year later to visit Cox in the White House. I mean, in the State House in Massachusetts. And Cox says, I just don't understand it. He said, when you were governor, you would get out of here every day at 5 o'clock. He said, you never stayed later. He says, I'm here sometimes till 8, 9, sometimes 10 o'clock at night. She says, Vice President Coolidge, he says, how did you get out of here? People just were talking to me all day long. How did you get out of here so early? And Coolidge looks at him and he says, you talk back.
Aha. So he would just shut up.
Yeah, so that's what he was known for. The other instance was, of course, this is the off-quoted address when he was involved in a state dinner when he was president, and someone said, I've made a bet with somebody that I can get 3 words out of you tonight. And Coolidge looks and deadpans, you lose.
That's only very good.
And I'll give you one other. He was asked at one point after coming out of church, someone said, what did the preacher talk about today? He said, sin. He was against it.
Excellent. You always blow me away with both your knowledge of the facts and ability to synthesize them into great stories. You do speaking engagements quite a lot, correct?
Yep. I've been speaking to a lot of senior centers, a lot of some assisted living facilities around Massachusetts about stuff that's in the book and just about kind of the political kind of temperature, if you will. But it's been an interesting ride.
They're really good books, and they're substantial as well. Thank you very much, folks. If you share this, it'll be a big help for both of us. And Rich, it's really a pleasure to talk to you. Hope we can do it again soon.
I greatly enjoyed it. I can't wait to come back.
All right. Thank you. And bye all. we'll be clear. Don't leave though, Rich. We'll be clear from the live